in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 9, you would find Jesus giving his Sermon on the Mount, and in particular in that part of his discourse, he's speaking on prayer, and he says these words in Matthew 6:9. He says to the people that were there listening, "Pray then like this." Turn to somebody beside you and tell them, "Pray like this." Pray like this. We're going to enter into a new series over the next few weeks. We're going to take a dive into prayer for a little bit. Ask any follower to name a spiritual discipline that's to be an active part of their life, and prayer will almost always be one of the first that they call out. Ask that same follower to name a spiritual discipline that they most lack or struggle in, and once again, prayer most always finds itself being the first one called out. So that tells me one thing in particular. It tells me that we know we need to be praying. We just seem to struggle in actually praying for any myriad of reasons, the list of which would be far too long for us to discuss in its totality tonight. But how many of you can relate to struggling in prayer, to having a consistent prayer life, to having a deep prayer life, to having more of a prayer life to where it seems like it's more than just getting up to the ceiling and bouncing right back down? I think it's an age-old struggle for believers when it comes to our prayer life. And that being said, I'm convinced there's nothing new under the sun that could be written or said about prayer. There are more books, there's more studies, there's more curriculum, there's more guides that can be accessed concerning the topic of prayer, how we should be praying, ways to enhance your prayer life, ways to prioritize prayer life. I got any number of 37 books on my bookshelf in my office right now concerning the very topic. So there's nothing new that we're going to discover tonight. There's nothing said that hasn't already been spoken about prayer by people that are far more prayer-minded and prayer-hearted than I am. So our goal over the next few weeks concerning prayer isn't to make a discovery, but to have a dialogue. We're going to talk through some things together as it pertains to prayer, and that's essentially what we find Jesus doing here in Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount. He's covered a lot of different things. And then he takes a stop on prayer for a little bit. So we're going to pick up there in chapter 6 and verse 5. Jesus speaks, and he says, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." So Jesus gives out some instruction on prayer, and in so doing lays out what we popularly identify as the Lord's Prayer. And any person in this room that's played any kind of organized athletic activity knows this prayer more than likely by heart. It was what you just recited before you went out and played, and most of you could spout it out just like that. For some of us, it's the only scripture we ever memorized, sadly enough. But most of us, that's our association with what we know to be the Lord's Prayer. And really what this prayer is, it's a model. It's a template that Jesus gave as a base for how we are to build our prayers when speaking to our Father. It's never meant to be anything that we just added into some incantation or recited off the top of our heads that's in a mindless and meaningless way. He gave it to us to serve as an example, to mold and shape our prayers in when we're speaking to our Father. And we're going to look at that more so in the coming weeks, and the elements that we find in the Lord's Prayer that should be existent in our prayer lives as well. But as Jesus goes into this teaching about how we should pray, he leads into it by showing us how we shouldn't. Did you notice at the beginning? Jesus is going to give a little discourse on how to pray, but at the beginning he says, when you pray, don't. So he leads out by talking about how we shouldn't be praying, or the things that shouldn't be a part of our prayer life. So we're going to start by identifying with Jesus some phony prayer. Jesus says, first things first, there are a few no-nos when it comes to prayer. The first of which we find in verse 5. He says, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Everybody say, no, no. No, no. Verse 7, we find the second part of what Jesus says we're not supposed to be doing with our prayers. When you pray, do not heap up empty phrases, as the Gentiles do, for they think they will be heard for their many words. Everybody say, no, no. No, no. So we've got a few no-nos when it comes to our prayer lives. So let's talk a little bit about what phony prayer is and some of the things that we need to avoid in our prayer life. First and foremost, phony prayer is public without existing in private. Jesus' opening statement on prayer starts out with a caution for us not to be like the hypocrites. Now, a little bit of familiarity with the term hypocrite. In those days, it was actually used as a title for Greek actors that used various masks during plays to perform various roles. And Jesus takes that and applies it to the religious people who essentially do the same thing. He says, don't be like the hypocrites who, with their acting, play the part that they find themselves in. And as Jesus looks across the landscape of the religious people of his time, he says, I see a lot of hypocrites in the church. I see a lot of people that put on a mask. I see a lot of people that say one thing with their mouth, but their lives, if you look closely enough, act out something completely different. And he says specifically, I see this taking place in their prayer lives. They make one claim, but they live by another. It's a mask. It's phony. It's fake. He says these people, they love to pray out in the open and be seen by others. Jesus says you don't want to be like the hypocrites. When they pray, they love to stand on the street corner. They love to spill out these boisterous, over-extensionalized, very spiritual prayers where people are attracted to listen to them, and they're full of all these deep theological words that people around them can't understand, and they're quoting scriptures, whole scriptures, because, these religious people, they were like legitimately religious. They would be quoting the entire first 5 books of the Old Testament. They could spout it out at any time. All these things are being incorporated in their prayers, but Jesus says there's hypocrisy here. None of these people ever seem to want to talk to me in private. And so listen, per Jesus' admonition, we shouldn't be praying in public if we aren't actively praying in private. In other words, given the opportunity to pray in public, if we are, I would suggest that if you yourself aren't actively praying in private, you respectfully decline that opportunity. Why? Because Jesus sees the hypocrisy in it. Why would we take an opportunity to openly pray in public if we aren't actively praying in private? Well, one main reason, because we want to be seen. And there's some dangers in that, some particular ones that I want to highlight. And the first one is this: it's showy. If we want to take an opportunity to pray in public, but we aren't also actively praying in private, the danger is that it's very showy on our behalf. It's all the attention being called to self. When Jesus calls out these hypocrites, he's like, I'm not big on this prayer here because it's showy. Notice what he says in verse 5. He says they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners that they may be seen by others. Jesus calls out the motive of their hearts. He says these people, when they're praying, they don't want to be heard by my Father as much as they want to be seen by people. And he calls them on it. So the danger in this kind of prayer is that it's showy. It's an attention call to self. It also seeks reaction. It seeks reaction from the people around them. I would be willing to bet more times than not when these people were standing in these places and spilling out these elaborate prayers, more times than not they had one eye open looking at the people around them to see what kind of reaction they were getting. They were wanting some kind of an approval. They were wanting some kind of an applause. They likely spent time beforehand rehearsing these prayers before they ever went out, trying to see if they could zing out a one-liner that they knew would get a reaction from somebody, or that it'd get quoted later on social media and their names would be tagged to it. Like they might have spent painstaking moments thinking, oh yeah, that's going to get somebody right there. I'm going to get an amen out of that one. Somebody going, hallelujah that. Jesus calls that the hypocrisy, and it's them seeking a reaction from other people around them. And it's also one last thing, which is probably the most dangerous of it all, is that it's laced with pride. It's an attempt to elevate self-importance. Jesus says these people love to stand in places of importance. They love to be on the street corners. They love to be at the head of the synagogues where people can see and hear all the things that they're spilling out. It's laced with pride. It's them attempting to elevate themselves. Listen to me. The last thing that we need to carry into our prayers is pretentiousness. Honestly, how dare we? How dare we use prayer in such a way to make much out of ourselves, to call attention to ourselves, to try and place eyeballs upon ourselves? The bottom line is, when it comes to prayer, Jesus sets the tone early on. Prayer is not meant to be about us in any way, form, or fashion. We are by no means meant to be the central point of focus. And we're going to get into that more later on. That's why when Jesus starts his prayer, he says, when you pray, pray like this: Our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Why do you think Jesus started out his prayer modeling for us the fact that God is to be the central focus point? It's because we have such an inclination to make ourselves that. Jesus says, when you pray, our Father who is in heaven, glory to you. All eyes on you. We fixate on you, not on us. Jesus lets us know quite the opposite. It's about him in all ways. And then he goes on to add on to the fact, we're not going to spend a lot of time here because it's for a later time, that the Father actually prefers the private. He says when you pray, actually, you go into your secret room and you pray to your Father who is in secret. And he hears in secret and he rewards in such ways. Jesus actually said these people that love to do this, that this is the reward that they're seeking, he says they actually have it. They love to be seen by people. He says God actually grants that, but that's all they get, to be seen by people. There's no impact. There's no change. There's no transformation. There's no depth. There's no growth in it for them. He actually gives them what they want. He says, you want to be seen by people? The Father says, okay, fine, but that's all you're ever going to experience. That's empty. It's phony prayer. It's public without existing in private. Second thing is phony prayer is redundant but not persistent. This is where we find Jesus' second no-no when it comes to our praying. He says, don't heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think they'll be heard for their many words. The Gentiles in those times had any number of pagan gods they worshipped, many of which included their own prayers or their chants that they would use. And essentially what these became is they became vain, repetitious, meaningless, and mindless chants, prayers that they would just spout out of their mouths, much like we do oftentimes with the Lord's Prayer. And there was no sincerity behind it. There was no heart behind it. As a matter of fact, we find an example of this with Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Carmel. When they're praying out to Baal, what they would have been doing was they would have been reciting chants or prayers that they had memorized, incantations, so to speak, that they just repeated over and 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 over again. And remember who heard the prayers of those people? Oh, that's right. There was no what? There's no response. Why? Because it's vain. It's empty. There's no substance to it. And Jesus uses this as an example of something that the Father takes no delight in. Why? Because it's not real. There's no heart in it whatsoever. And I know we've never been guilty of doing such. None of us have ever been guilty of repeating the same repetitious, vain prayers that have no meaning or no sincerity behind them. We might as well just move on because we don't deal with that at all, do we? None of us adults in the room ever do it. Except for all of us when we sit down and we ask the Lord to use this food for the nourishment of our bodies and our bodies for your service. But that's something different. I mean that. I totally mean that. I never just say that when it comes time to eat my food, like, right? We're never guilty of it. You know who can teach you a really good lesson on this is children. Children, when they first begin to learn how to pray, will latch on, I've seen, to certain phrases or requests, and they'll make those requests known time and time again, and they'll say it so fast that if you hadn't heard it the first couple of times, you wouldn't even know what it was. I'm going to bust on my sister a little bit on this. She did this until she was about 14 years old. My dad can tell you. You could ask him tonight. Tell me what Caitlin's bedtime routine was and the things that had to be said in order for her to go to sleep that night. There were specific words and phrases that had to be said in that order in order for bedtime to actually take place. It's funny how children are kind of like that at times. And you have to be taught. Even now, we sit down and have a conversation with Graham because we'll pray about the same things. And he'll just rattle them off just that quick. We're talking about, son, like we need to mean, if we're going to pray those things, let's mean those things. And like, oh, come on, Trey, we're being a little harsh. And plus, aren't we supposed to continually bring our requests before the Lord? Doesn't he want us to make those things known? Absolutely, as long as there's sincerity behind it. The problem is when we find ourselves in those kind of moments at times, we just rattle those things off. And we get to the point when in our prayer lives, there's no imploring of the Lord to act, to heal, or to save. And Jesus isn't saying that we shouldn't repeatedly make requests known. Listen, he's all for persistence, but not redundancy. Not something that just mindlessly repeats itself over and over again. What he simply asks for in our prayers is that our heart be behind them. That true sincerity exists in what we ask for. Jesus actually, he shows us that prayer isn't meant to lack depth, intimacy, or purpose. Now, a true self-evaluation. How many of your prayers can you say honestly contain depth, intimacy, and purpose every time you send them up? That's why, considering these things, he followed it up with this. Pray then like this. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.